Immigration. It is one of the key issues in President Trump's bid for re-election. But as Democrats make their pitches for the White House, does their criticism of the president's policies lack any specifics about overhauling the system? Josh Jamerson is a Wall Street Journal reporter covering national politics in the 2020 race. He joins me now from Des Moines, Iowa. Thank you very much for coming on. Okay, maybe you can fill us in from your experience on the campaign trail. What are the Democrats saying and not saying when it comes to immigration?
Well, what's really interesting, I think, is that the Democratic candidates are outlining a lot of policies on reining in student debt, the cost of tuition, taxing the wealthy and corporations, but they don't really get into the intricacies of how they would reform the immigration system, and instead are offering the Democratic voters here in Iowa and elsewhere more of a values-based, what they call a values-based contrast to President Trump on immigration. And that is because the zero-tolerance policy that resulted in the separation of families along the southern border still hits home with so many Democrats and some Republicans who objected to that policy. So they're mostly focusing on highlighting that contrast between the president and less on how to actually, they would actually have the immigration system work with this asylum crisis on the southern border.
Advocates worry Democrats are ceding ground in a general election campaign because they're not pursuing concrete alternatives, especially on asylum, for example, that speak to centrist voters. This is something they need to do. Are these same Democrats, do you think, blowing their chances to have policy debates now that's going to ultimately shape their ability to govern if they actually win the White House?
Well, to be sure, there are a lot of progressive voters who want to hear the Democratic candidates talking about President Trump's immigration policy and want to hear just how opposed the candidates are to that policy. So I do think that it is kind of a red meat issue to draw that contrast with President Trump. But yes, there are definitely some advocates who say that to govern effectively, if you do win the White House, that you need to go out and ask voters for a mandate. And one of the contrasts that some of my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal had noted were that it's not that dissimilar from when Republicans railed against the Affordable Care Act and sought to draw a contrast between themselves to Obamacare, and then when they had control of all of Washington, they had some political struggles in repealing and replacing because they didn't actually have a mandate from voters on what repeal and replace would look like. So there are some advocates who say that Democrats could run into the same issue with immigration. Okay, well, there are Democrats that are talking about it. It's just a matter of what they're going to do about it, because at this point, it's all talk. Here's a taste of what some, 2020 Democratic presidential candidates are saying, and they are talking, so let's listen to what they have to say.
The truth is, President Trump's immigration policy is inhumane, ineffective, and wrong. As President of the United States, I wouldn't use the detention system at all.
You asked what I would do differently? I would never again separate another family when they come here at their most vulnerable and desperate moment.
There's a lot more to security than putting up a wall from sea to shining sea.
Believes ripping children from the arms of their parents at the border. No, we don't, but Trump does.
Okay, so that has been, the montage of the campaign, and since the president took office, separating families. That has been the Democrats' target, right? It obviously drew a lot of criticism, but at the same time, so should parents who are renting their kids to strangers to help them illegally cross the border, then abandon their kids and run. That is not being talked about by the Democrats. Yes, there's a dire humanitarian issue here. The question is, while Democrats complain about all these deaths of illegal migrants on the border and they blame the administration, the question is, once these families get in, what is the U.S. supposed to do with them? Just set them free?
Well, there's obviously a huge contentious debate in Washington and around the country on that exact question. I think that the difference that Democratic candidates are quick to point out between past flows of migrants to the border and this current humanitarian crisis, and the Democratic candidates do acknowledge and call it a humanitarian crisis, is that unlike individual job seekers who were trying to get into the country illegally, this crisis that we have now is not unlike border issues we've seen over in Europe, where there are people escaping violence and famine, and sometimes have no place else to go and are freely turning themselves into border agents. And that is where the crisis develops, because the U.S. immigration laws right now were not built for that type of flow.
Well,
there is a lot of debate about what to do about that, but the candidate that has probably the most comprehensive plan is probably former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julian Castro.
Okay.
He's put out a very comprehensive plan that calls for adding more immigration judges and a host of other issues. And even other candidates have jumped onto that plan.
The candidates,
Elizabeth Warren.
The candidate, or the one candidate, of course, who is obviously dominating when it comes to trying to sell his message as the president, because this is what he plans on running on. He is dominating Democrats in swing states with his digital campaign on immigration issues. Take a look at money spent per campaign on Facebook immigration ads. The president in the lead, spending over $200,000. That's 7 times the amount of his top-tier Democratic opponents. The question I want to ask you before I leave, if the Democrats want to compete on immigration, okay, and that is a top key issue, what do they need to do to convince their voters that they are on top of this issue as well? By calling it a dire humanitarian issue, anybody could do that. It's the solution. It's finding a fix. That's what people are waiting to hear. And so far, they haven't really come up with one.
Well, I think that'll be for Democratic voters to decide, but in talking to a few of the candidates themselves and a few of their surrogates, I think what they've concluded now on this issue and a few others is that voters, Democratic voters who will be participating in this primary process, would be willing to forgive a lack of specifics because of how vehemently opposed they are to President Trump's policies. And then once they move into the general election, whoever the eventual nominee is would put forth a more specific plan to compete with the president.
All right. Josh Jamerson, thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.